Courtney, I want to say absolutely brilliant your presentation was.
Well, thank you.
Totally amazing research and bringing forward such a relatively unknown piece of our history that is really crucial. And I'm just awed at what you have done and how beautifully you've presented it. So,
well, coming from you, that really means something to me. You made my day. Thank you.
Okay, so then what I want to look at was the sort of climate of popular astrological belief during this time period around the birth of Jesus that was roughly synchronistic with the birth of Augustus, and how astrology influenced that, not only in terms of the actual astrology, but also in terms of the popular opinions and beliefs about astrology. And that it was out there in the collective that astrology could legitimize the authority of a ruler. This was an important inquiry that clients brought to astrologers, and astrologers are scrambling to figure out, does my chart have the signature of the attainment of high status and position of power? For the ancient person during this time period, generally there was not a belief in reincarnation, but there was still the desire for immortality. And one gained immortality by one's name being remembered after death. And that would happen if one achieved a high status during one's lifetime. So the whole inquiry for eminence in a chart, and more than just ordinary eminence, does my chart have the signature for royalty? The Hellenistic, and here you kept saying, I don't know what Hellenistic means. Let me just do a little side thing and define it. Politically, the Hellenistic era begins with the death of Alexander, and when all of the territory he had conquered was divvied up among his generals. And it ends with the Battle of Actium, where Augustus defeats Mark Antony. And then the rule of the Roman Empire begins. But culturally, the Hellenistic era, it stands from the death of Alexander until about the 6th century CE, 6th or 7th century CE. But it wasn't just Greeks or Greeks and Romans. It also included the term Hellenistic, all of the peoples of the Mediterranean basin. And as I mentioned before, many of the astrological texts were not written by Greeks or Romans, but by people from the ancient Near East. But they were written in the Greek language.
Demetra, do you mind if I just add to that? Because I think that's when we talk about confronting our biases and putting them out on the table, I think the term Hellenistic actually masks a certain Western European cultural bias in trying to make great achievements of science look a lot more European than they actually were, starting with the fact that Alexander wasn't Greek.
Right, he was Macedonian.
Yeah.
Right, but nevertheless, if we are doing historical presentations trying to elevate astrology in the minds of the larger public, then we need at some point to use terminology which is a common terminology. And if we came up with some other word and started using it, people who weren't familiar with that wouldn't know what you're talking about anymore. But certainly that word can be asterized and footnoted, and to have that comment there. And I agree with you that there is a Eurocentric flavor to it. And what I'm going to talk about now is the Eurocentric popular belief among the Greek and Romans around the time of the birth and death of Jesus and the creation of the Gospels. So I'm shifting the focus from Persia to Rome in what I'm going to be conveying next. And in this astrology of this time period, there were, as you read through it, they'll say, oh, and when such and such a planet is angular and enclosed by the benefics and is in the 10th house, this is a signature of a notable nativity. Or if it has all of these indications of spear-bearing bodyguards, this is an indication of a notable nativity. And I'm not going to take you through the astrology of that year because there's more of a historical thing I'm trying to do. But one example of how the notable nativities were used comes from a little bit later, that Septimus Severus, one of the Roman emperors, he was a Roman general from Libya, and he had aspirations of greater political power. And in consulting an astrologer about the horoscopes of marriageable women, he learned that the chart of Julia Dama, a daughter of a Roman high priest in Syria, indicated that she would become the wife of a king. So he said, oh, that's the woman I want. And we're told in the ancient texts here, Scriptura Historia Augusti is what SHA stands for, that he sought her for his wife and through the mediation of his friends secured her. And in fact, he did reign as emperor after his marriage to Julia Dama. So it was stories like this that bolster people's like curiosity and enthusiasm and a compelling need to know, well, does my chart show such a destiny? So taking our story back now to the time when we're still in the Roman Republic, on the day of Augustus's birth in September of 63 BCE, the following story was related by the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote the lives of the 12 Caesars. And he said that Publius Nigritius Figulus, who was a Roman senator, a famed astrologer, and a personal friend of Cicero, was credited with having prophesied the future grandeur of Augustus. And the day he was born, the conspiracy of Catiline was before the house, and Augustus's father, Octavius, came late to the Senate because of his wife's confinement. Then Publius Nigritius, as everyone knows, learning the reason for his tardiness and being informed also of the hour of the birth, declared that the ruler of the world had been born. Again, this is the story that Suetonius relates in his books on the lives of the Caesars. And here what I'm trying to do is to use my primary source references as much as possible. And to add a colophon that we don't know if this is really true, but this is as close as we can get to the time that showed what the people of that time believed. Here we have like that difference between history and historiography emerging. So the second celestial event that Augustus was connected with that I want to discuss was on the day of the games that Julius Caesar had, in which he commemorated the day that Augustus, who was to be his heir, would be consecrated. A comet appeared in the northern part of the sky and was visible for 7 days. Pliny tells us the common people believed that it was the soul of Caesar being received into heaven. But Augustus privately rejoiced because he interpreted the comet as having been born for his own sake, appearing at the beginning of his rule and commemorating the heavens' approval of his reign. So it reflected a growing belief that each person's life destiny was linked to the appearance of a particular star. So Suetonius continues his narrative, and the events that take place a year later when Augustus was 18 years old. And this was right after Caesar's assassination. And he tells us Augustus went with his friend Agrippa to visit Theogenes, the astrologer, who was in retirement at Apollonia, a Greek colony. And Agrippa, who had first consulted the fates, meaning the astrologer, had great and almost incredible things predicted of him. Augustus, therefore, did not wish to make known his nativity and persisted for some time in the refusal, for a mixture of shame and fear, lest his own fate should be predicted as inferior to that of Agrippa. However, when Augustus had been persuaded, after much begging, to declare his nativity, Theogenes cast it, then rose from his chair and without a word threw himself at Augustus's feet. So it was not long afterwards, when Augustus became emperor, that he was so confident of the greatness of his destiny that he published his horoscope and struck a silver coin bearing the image of Capricorn, the moon sign under which he was born. So this has implied that the rest of his life, Augustus had great faith in his destiny as one being ordained by the stars. So after Augustus became emperor, he entertained astrologers in his court, and the poet Manilius praised him in his astrological poem, the Astronomica. Then Tiberius, Augustus's successor, studied astrology with his lifelong friend and teacher Thrasyllus and identified the charts of potential rivals who had notable nativities as people to watch out for or to take care of in other ways. And Thrasyllus' son Babylas became court astrologer to the next 4 emperors, warning them of critical times when they were most vulnerable to the attacks of their enemies. So during these early years of the empire, astrology was in the center of the Roman court, and the inquiry as to not only which rulers might have notable nativities, but which rivals to the throne might have them was a very important aspect of, let's say, homeland security. So here this is part of another thing, but I was just giving here the primary quotes here for Augustus receiving Thrasyllus into his dinner party and Tiberius being versed in astrology. So anyway, this was the milieu, the political climate as we get to 70 CE, around 70 CE, when the Gospel of Matthew was written. And as Courtney mentioned, it was the only gospel to contain the story of the Magi following the star and paying homage to the child who would be the King of the Jews that would be born, that was born under that star. And we have the reign of Augustus in the recent history, who is the temporal ruler of the earthy world, that his reign had been ordained and confirmed by the stars in the examples that we've given. And in the popular opinion of that time, it would certainly enhance the validity of Jesus as a spiritual ruler of heaven to also have a notable nativity, because that's what the rulers were going about, holding up their charts and parading that, you know, my legitimacy is authorized. So then what we have is, over the next 2,000 years, a plethora of speculative charts by astrologers and astronomers alike to identify the Star of Bethlehem. And this suggests that it may have not been that obvious a stellar configuration. And I'm not saying here that the star was not a real celestial event that signified a royal nativity, but that it doesn't make so much difference on an ultimate level whether it was true or not true, it was like great propaganda to assist in the spread of Christianity that their leader had a notable nativity, as had Augustus, with whom was his sort of contrast in the time period as the temporal and spiritual rulers of the era. So the story of the star, well, on one hand, and the popular astrological belief of the day, legitimized the preeminence of Jesus, but simultaneously created a host of problems for the development of Christianity. And afterwards, the Christian writers and scholars said, oh no, it's like if faith in Jesus as one Savior has the power to liberate people from their own fate as ordained by the stars, Jesus himself cannot be subject to being ruled by the stars. The issue of free will to choose between good and evil was at stake, something that was part of an individual's freedom of moral choice rather than ruled by the stars, which were now connected with demons. And so the generations of early Christianity, many of the Christian apologists, including John Chrysostom, asserted that really the star was not a real star at all, but some invisible power transformed into the appearance of a star. And Augustine says, it was a new star that shone because Christ was born, and its purpose was to point the way for the Magi to find the Word of God. So after having put up the story of Jesus being born under the star to help legitimize his rule, and as I said before, it doesn't mean that it wasn't real, but it was used as a propaganda tool in the centuries afterwards. Then Christian apologists had a job to undo the potential damaging implications that it suggested. And then just a curious event that Halleys Comet made a spectacular appearance in 66 CE, which was right around the time that the Gospel of Matthew was written, a little bit before or a little bit after. And the Magi and astronomical events were linked in the public minds. And the historians record a visit to Rome by a delegation of Magi led by King Tiridates of Armenia, who came seeking confirmation of his title from Emperor Nero. So again, in the public opinion, in the minds of the collective, the star, the Magi, and confirmation of one's royal power were all entwined in a story that has become one of the central stories of Christianity. I just want to finish this with, in my community, there's a church that every year they have a creche exhibition. And I love to go to it because they have this huge gymnasium room that's filled with hundreds and hundreds of little creche displays of Jesus and the manger and Mary and Joseph and the animals and the angels and the three Magi. And they come from all different countries, and it's beautiful to see how each country portrays the individuals according to their own costumes and facial features. But I've always been fascinated by looking to see how the Magi have been represented in each of the various creches, and which don't have them and which they really stand out. So that symbol of the Magi as wise Persian astrologers, and in the Oxford translation of the Bible, Magi is translated as astrologers, how they have been the symbol that has linked the astrologers to the birth of Jesus. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share. It's just a sort of colophon to what was going on in the Roman world around the issue of the star, and just a small piece to Courtney's like amazing presentation on the Persian material.
But it does bring us back to the Emperor Augustus and the year 27 BC. And you know, my favorite question that goes unstated, you know, and with Mashallah and Omar, because of course they might not have been able to get their heads around this. But in linking Christ and Augustus in that way astrologically, you know, who was the Jew who conquered Rome?
Yeah. Ultimately,
because that was what the Jews wanted, and they fought and died for, and it ended up losing them everything in 6 to 70 AD when the Romans just destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and wiped the nation of Judea off the face of the earth until after World War II. And yet, who was the Jew who conquered Rome?
Right.
And how did he do it?
Right, by the time of Constantine, Christianity was now the official state religion of the empire.
Yeah, one of the greatest ironies of history. And yet, in all of this, you know, in everything that we've covered, there's no mention of the age of Pisces and the precession of the equinox, which is the other, you know, issue I think we need to, you know, look at. If you can take your screen share off for a second, I want to certainly check in with the people in the room and make sure that if anybody's got any questions or comments or wants to chime in on anything, we'd be happy to hear from you. And we do want to discuss precession and, you know, the Age of Aquarius, because that again is another thing that you know, really I find in my years in the astrological community, it's sort of accepted that you're supposed to believe that we're on the brink of the Age of Aquarius, and you're supposed to just buy into this whole organization of history according to Astrological World Ages based upon the precession of the equinoxes. And in fact, you know, as I said, I studied under Nick Campion, who in a lot of ways has built part of his career on debunking that whole notion. And you know, Nick's point, which he's published extensively on, and particularly in books like The Great Year, was that, and I'm paraphrasing him, so I want to be careful, was that people weren't really paying that much attention to precession. They were much more interested in what we would call the commensurability of the planetary orbits. In other words, you know, that old myth that at the beginning of creation, all the planets were lined up in a big conjunction at 0 degrees Aries, and they're off. And, you know, they orbit around in, you know, specific periods, and at a certain point, they're all going to come back and conjunct at 0 degrees Aries again. And again, this is what became known as a commensurability of the planetary orbits, and defined the Great Year. And there's no doubt that it was a very influential way of thinking. And a lot of people wrote and published on it, and particularly a lot of these time frames that you see of 360,000 years, or 36,000 years, you know, he uses a lot. Those, to some extent, come out of that theory. Now, you know, I listened to Nick at Spot, and I'd been, you know, brought up in the whole New Age of Aquarius concept. I kept saying, you know, I don't think that it's really fair to say that people weren't using precession. Obviously, they were using the planetary orbits. You know, there's plenty of evidence for that. And it kind of became a passion of mine to really look at, you know, had they used precession in time in history? And how had they used it? And could we find any evidence of people using it within the church, within Christianity? And that actually became my thesis. And asking that question, did Christians use precession to time the apocalypse, heaps and the return of Jesus Christ, Persian conceptions. That's where I started, and I actually started with Isaac Newton because he did. And again, if anybody wants to chime in or ask any questions, please do, because I'm about to go back to my Star and the Magi website. I have a lot of material within the book on precession and the Age of Pisces. And then I also have a lot of material from the thesis there. And I want to look at some of the questions that we raise. Starting with Hipparchus, because I think, the consensus is, in a nutshell, that, okay, Hipparchus discovered the precession of the equinoxes. Okay, now that's a gross oversimplification. He's, let's say, one of the first to actually publish on it and to look at it as a mathematical phenomenon. And bear in mind, I think Hipparchus, bar none, is the greatest astronomer of the ancient world. He really covered all the bases. And he was also more famous as an astrologer. His contributions to mathematical astronomy maybe have never even been matched. But he was working from the records that the Babylonians had kept, and he had access to that, and he was able to realize that okay, the fixed stars were moving in relation to each other, but they were moving, and he published on it. So he's generally given in the history of science, the credit for discovering it, but I don't think that term's accurate. So again, I'm going to go to the Star of the Magi website. This is from the chapter Pisces and Precession. Again, you can go to the menu and follow along. It's down there. It's Pisces and Precession. As it says here, start with Hipparchus because he's given the credit. And in my pages from the Star of the Magi, I have, for the most part, included the endnotes along the side there. So I have all the sources and references in the endnotes here, and there's quite a few chapters on there. So it's a really good way to get into this material. Historians of astronomy like Neugebauer and Franz Kuhmann and Toomer, I quote copiously from these guys. They're really good guide stars. North, J.D. North, they're just masterful when it comes to, they're historians of astronomy. Okay, they're not astrologers, but astrology is bound up in the history of astronomy. You can't separate it. So they're just really great resources. And if you're reading, history of astrology written by astrologers and they're not referring to these people, I would be suspicious. So in talking about Hipparchus, they're commenting that Hipparchus's work on precession, which would be roughly around the time of Christ when he was writing, it seems to have lain kind of dormant until Ptolemy comes along, and Ptolemy is like the great broadcaster of Hipparchus's ideas. And in some ways he kind of screws up precession because he got the rate wrong. He quoted the wrong rate, and that created a lot of problems for centuries. But guys like Toomer, they comment that it seems like astronomers weren't really interested in the phenomenon in that gap from the time of Christ to maybe 200 years later, the time of Ptolemy. And they're wondering, why weren't the astronomers interested in this? And this caused me to raise a question that maybe they're looking in the wrong place, because if we consider the question of how Hipparchus's discovery of precession might have been received as an astrological doctrine, or how it might have impacted contemporary religious cosmologies and chronologies, we're suddenly faced with a startling realization. Because shortly after the time of Hipparchus in the first centuries BC and CE, the ancient world experienced an explosion of radical new religious chronologies based upon the idea of the end of the old world and the beginning of a new age and a new world order. And the most lasting and influential of those was Christianity, which from the very beginning proclaimed the apocalyptic coming of the kingdom of God with its own aeon and imminent Perusia, Alpha and Omega, the Piscean symbolism of the Christ fish. Christianity was the original New Age religion. And the deeper you go into the original text, the more this comes out, especially in those early centuries. And this elaborate Christian eschatology did not arise in a vacuum. It fit well within the broader social spectrum, where the early Christians were surrounded by other cults and sects who believed along much the same lines. For instance, the Gnostics, the cults of the Aeon and Mithras, and of course the solar emperor worship at the very heart of the Roman Empire. David Ulansey has published extensively on this. I'd strongly recommend his work on the origins of the Mithric mysteries, where he claims that perhaps the symbolism of the Roman cults of Mithras, and particularly the tauroctomy, the bull slaying scene, is a representation of the discovery of Precession. It's good stuff. And, you know, regardless of how the discoveries of Hipparchus would have been received, there's a lot of questions that remain unresolved scientifically, but I think, again, maybe they're looking in the wrong places for the impact of this discovery. Maybe it's hidden in the symbolism of the Mithrians. Many of the older cosmological myths and deities were attached to the Mithraic iconography in a new way, and Mithras was increasingly portrayed as a composite of the gods in charge of a changing cosmos. This was obviously something people were very concerned about, but they wrestled with it. Maybe it survives in the fish stories and the Christian Gospels, or in the Fisher Saga of the Mandean cults of John the Baptist. People, if you haven't read the Fisher Sagas of the Mandean cults of John the Baptist, Google them now. Oh my God, they'll change your life. Where, you know, they appear in the symbolic guise of the good fisher who comes to save his fish. Maybe it survives in the poetry of Virgil, who in the opening of his fourth Eclogue from 37 BC heralded the dawn of a new age with the return of Saturn and virgin justice, saying, now the last age by Cumae's Simul sung has come and gone, and the majestic world of circling centuries begins anew. All these breathtaking new visions of time, where circling aeons and swirling centuries are all cycling up to their inevitable conclusion and glorious rebirth, emerged in the wake of the discoveries of Hipparchus. And who's to say they were wrong? After all, we still organize time, whether BC or AD, along those same lines. Perhaps at least one of the reasons the books of Hipparchus and his unknown commentators did not survive the copying process was because some of the ideas in them were too controversial and uncomfortably close to Orthodox Christian eschatology. But nowhere, and this is my main point here, nowhere in all of this fascinating chronology do we find anything even remotely akin to the declaration in the rock musical Hair of the dawning of the age of Pisces, and there's very good reason for that. As excited as people were about all the religious and chronological implications of the heavens in motion, they really did not understand the mechanics or the math sufficiently to think about it in that way. And when we try to project that back on them, as astrology pop history does, I think we miss the important stuff, which is all the things they actually were doing and all the different things they actually did believe about it, which are often a lot more interesting. And we're getting some comments here. I just want to check in. Okay. And yes, I think we're getting ready to wrap up, and people are starting to take off. We've been here almost 3 hours. So again, when you're hearing the typical Age of Aquarius thing, please bear in mind that I think many people have made a good case. Nick Campion's one of them, but also skeptics have made the case that you really can't find any firm evidence of using precession to create astrological world ages of 2,100 years in length. That's a late 19th century development, and there's a guy named Jared Massey, books about the Watermen that we can point to. And then Blavatsky picked it up and spread it throughout Theosophy. The rest is history. But we don't find evidence of that kind of thinking before that time. And there's very good reason for that. And that's because people did not understand the math and the mechanism of precession until Newton. It was Newton who cracked the code. And he did it simultaneously with Flamsteed, but Newton gets most of the credit. But before that time, there was tremendous disagreement about the motion, what it was. People actually believed it was an eighth sphere. They just did not think about the universe the same way that we did, and they didn't understand the rate. And the rate had been miscalculated in certain quarters. They also believed in trepidation. They didn't think it was all continuously one way, that they thought it would stop and turn around and go backwards because they were working with the wrong rates. So you want, it's a fine point, but it's worth making. I'm not in any way saying that they weren't aware of precession. They were, and as we see in this explosion around the time of Christ, of this kind of crisis in the way this thinking about cosmology of a moving cosmos, they were aware that it was moving, but they didn't think of it as we're going into an astrological new age of Pisces. It's going to last 2,100 years, and then it's going to be the age of Aquarius. That you're not going to find. And when astrologers project that back upon history, as they are so wont to do, going back to the age of Cancer and the age of Leo, as Demetra will agree, some of these constellations are newer than others. I mean, Aries is a very new constellation. To try to think that they were anticipating an age of Aries, it just doesn't jive with what we know about the historical developments. Constellations, these questions are a lot more complex. And when we project that pop astrology history on it, everybody does, what we're doing is we're really missing a lot of the exciting stuff that people were doing with it. So I want to leave it there because it's 3 hours. And we could go for another 3 easily. But thank you all. Thank you, Demetra, so much for being here and for sharing your great work with us. We're really looking forward to see your book at the Kepler conference and also your paper on the different houses. I know it's going to be fascinating. I hope you all will join us there. Hopefully in person. If you can't come in person, then please join us online. And thank you so much for being in here today. If there's any comments or questions before we go, we'll be happy to take them.